Newsfirst, Newsline.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Newsline. You're with me, Shehan Ranatunga, who's sitting in for Farah Shaukatali. And we've got with us a regular face on Newsline, but one that we always look forward to seeing on our program because his knowledge and wealth of knowledge, insights, bring out or help us understand what's going on better. And right now we want to understand even better the recent good news that we received that the IMF has agreed to provide Sri Lanka with this bailout package that's been much awaited. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight. We've got Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, who was the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Shehan.
Doctor, so first of all, your first impressions. Good news?
Well, of course, it's a good news in the sense that you may recall, Shehan, that all the independent economists like me had asked the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration as far back as December 2019 to seek a facility from IMF because we had predicted at that time that the Sri Lanka's economy was not in the good shape and we were heading towards a big disaster. And to avoid that, we had prescribed that Sri Lanka should seek IMF assistance. But the economic policy makers in this government, like the former central bank governor W. Lakshman and the state minister Ajit Cabral, they took a different view and they said the IMF was not the solution. And they said they have an alternative method and kept on postponing seeking this assistance. And but of course, after they had left the place, last year when Sri Lanka had to suspend the repayment of debt on account of what Sri Lanka had borrowed from bilateral creditors and the commercial creditors in April last year, it was too late. And we had run into the gravest economic crisis. And now, after 1 year, after seeking this assistance from IMF, it's actually good news that IMF has decided to grant this facility to Sri Lanka.
So, Doctor, looking at the road ahead, if we can just look at it in that context, is it an easy ride now going ahead now that we have this, or is it more of a bumpy ride? Is it going to be a hard road ahead?
Well, it is a hard road, even though President Ranil Wickremesinghe had, announced at various fora that Sri Lanka is no more a bankrupt country. Sri Lanka is a bankrupt country. Our economic growth is negative and it's going to be negative in this year as well as next year also. And our foreign external sector comprising the balance of payments and the exchange rate is in trouble. The government cannot raise enough money to meet its expenditure, so the budget is also in trouble. In the case of the monetary sector, we have the huge expansion of money orchestrated by the previous administration, and that has caused the inflation to rise to say 50%. Still, the prices are rising at 50% share. And the things that we have to do in order to correct all these ailments are not very, rosy. And it's not a bumpy road. Actually, it's a very treacherous road because if you put your foot on the wrong place, probably, we might end up in a greater disaster than the disaster that we had last year.
Now, Professor, Sri Lanka has received an immediate disbursement of $330 million from the IMF, the president announced today in Parliament. Now, how will this money be spent?
Well, Shehan, that is a peanut compared to the enormity of the problems Sri Lanka is facing. Because our foreign exchange problem cannot be resolved by just getting this $330 million from IMF. Prime purpose of giving that money to us is to enable the central bank to build up its foreign reserves so that it will first come to the central bank. But on the request of the government of Sri Lanka, the IMF has agreed that if the government this money can be used to finance the budget also. But that's a second, it's nothing to do with IMF. It's something which the Minister of Finance and the central bank has to come to an agreement, because once this money is received by Sri Lanka into the accounts of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, the borrower on behalf of the government of Sri Lanka is the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. If the Treasury uses this money for budgetary purposes as announced by the President, we have to sign a separate agreement with the Central Bank. The creditor, the liability which will have to be passed from the Central Bank to the Treasury, and therefore it has to be sanctioned by the IMF again. But given the present, the very low level of foreign reserves in the country, even the IMF staff report that was submitted to its executive board had noted that the usable foreign reserves with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka was around some 425 million US dollars. So there is the necessity for the Central Bank to build up these reserves. So giving this money to government for financing the budget is a luxury which the Ministry of Finance will have, Shehan. So I don't think that the Central Bank would permit that to happen at the right moment, because if it happens, the Central Bank will lose the ability to build up its reserves.
So looking at it from the situation on the ground, Professor, because ultimately it's the public, the general public, who are paying the taxes. They're the ones who are feeling the pinch with the increased cost of living and so on. So from the ordinary common citizen's perspective, will they see any change? Will they be able to experience any improvement, do you think, in the near future?
What would happen, Shehan, is that, Sri Lanka being a bankrupt nation is like a leper. I mean, nobody wants to touch Sri Lanka. No international creditor wanted to lend any money to Sri Lanka. No, any foreign commercial lender wanted to lend any money to Sri Lanka. So we had been starved of the essential foreign exchange requirements. What happens right now is that when the global community comes to know that Ranil Wickremesinghe administration is subject to discipline by the International Monetary Fund, there is a kind of a trust that may be built up. Because of that trust, we may be able to get some foreign assistance in the form of foreign exchange inflows to the country. That will enable the central bank as well as the government to relax some of the draconian import controls which they had introduced to Sri Lanka's economy right now. So the controls are actually starving the industries of the essential raw materials. Then we don't have enough medicine in hospitals, and there's a shortage of medicine. Right now, there are no power cuts because the people are now paying a higher tariff to the Ceylon Electricity Board, and Ceylon Electricity Board has been able to buy power from the private power producers at a very high rate, and therefore that particular cost, as we have said, has been passed on to people of this country. But when Sri Lanka will lose its foreign exchange reserves, if it doesn't have sufficient foreign exchange reserve, because we need about 5 to 6 billion foreign exchange reserves right now, and Sri Lanka will not be able to go on with the import program of oil, energy, then there will be a problem for even the private electricity producers to produce electricity. So given that particular situation, everything will depend on how prudently this particular borrowing from the IMF is managed with other creditors who are willing to lend money to Sri Lanka. So it all depends on the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration to come up with a very prudent program of utilizing this money.
Now, adding to what you just said, Doctor, we know that the IMF program, Sri Lanka could receive up to $3 billion in total, but apparently there's up to $7 billion that may be available to Sri Lanka through other creditors, the World Bank, ADB, etc. Am I correct?
Well, of course, according to a press notice issued by the President's Media Division, it has been, claimed that Sri Lanka might be able to have access to up to $7 billion US. But the report which the IMF staff has presented to its executive board doesn't talk about any 7 billion there. What they talk about is about, say, 3.25 billion US dollars, which Sri Lanka can get from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and the bilateral creditors who are willing to give us credit over a period of another 4.5 years, not immediately. So the 7 billion which the president thinks that Sri Lanka would be getting may be from some other source, not from these three sources. So it is better that he would immediately tap those sources and get this money to Sri Lanka, so that Sri Lanka would be able to meet its foreign exchange requirements immediately. Otherwise, these 3.725 billion to be received from these sources are to be received by Sri Lanka over a period of 4.5 years. Then they would be dependent on our having worthwhile projects to receive that money. And it all will depend on the implementation of these projects. So it's not something that is automatically received by Sri Lanka. It is something for which Sri Lanka will have to apply again, as we had done in the case of the IMF loan, to those creditors to disperse this money as quickly as possible.
Doctor, the IMF says that revenue should be increased in a growth-friendly manner. Now, is the government doing it in a growth-friendly manner, or is it a politically friendly manner?
Well, of course, there's a necessity for the government to increase its revenue base, Shehan, because revenue had fallen to a very low level due to the tax cuts introduced by Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration. They had fallen to a level of about 8% of GDP. Now, the objective of the IMF program is to increase it to 10% of GDP this year, then gradually increase it to 15% of GDP by the time the IMF program is over in 2028. This is a gigantic task. I mean, it's not a simple thing for the government to do that. Second one is, whatever the money that is transferred from the private sector to the government by way of taxation will have to be used productively in enhancing the production base of the country. So what it means is the government will have to utilize this money for the development of the infrastructure of the country, for the development of the education and health services, and not for any other consumption purposes which the government is actually right now doing. So for that purpose, a separate plan has to be prepared by the government, and that plan will have to be immediately introduced in order to make it a growth-friendly taxation system. Because whatever the tax that has been transferred from the private sector to the government sector, if it is wasted by the government by using it for consumption purposes, then it will not be a growth-friendly taxation system. It is actually growth-retarding taxation system. So this is a secondary thing which the government has to do right now, because you may recall that even people like us had argued IMF assistance is necessary but not sufficient, because what we need is not to just get the IMF assistance to stabilize the balance of payment. We wanted the IMF assistance to keep Sri Lanka afloat and enable Sri Lanka to have a very dynamic and viable growth plan. And even the president today, he had expressed the wish of converting Sri Lanka to a rich country by 2048. But remember now, the challenge that he's facing is, according to the predictions made by the IMF that have been submitted to the executive board, the growth in Sri Lanka right now is in the negative region. For example, in now we had our total economy was as big as 87 billion US dollars in year 2021. Now that has shrunk to 74 billion right now. So as a result, our per capita GDP, this I'm just quoting the IMF numbers. Per capita GDP, which was around say 3,900 US dollars in 2021, has gone down to 3,200 US dollars. And it will further go down to 3,100 US dollars. And by the time the IMF program is over, because the IMF is predicting a very pessimistic growth scenario for Sri Lanka, because by 28 we are going to get say 2% economic growth. So so what would happen is we will start with the level of about say 3,000 US dollars as our base income level to become a rich country. To become a rich country, Shehan, we must have a minimum level of say 12,000 US dollars. Now, from 3,000 to 1,200,000 means from 2028 onwards, we must have a minimum economic growth rate of 10% at a compound rate over the next, 20-year time period. So that is why I say that the introduction of a very dynamic economic growth plan is a must right now. And if we don't do that, we will not be able to get the best out of what the IMF has offered to us today.
Doctor, we must now cross over a short break as we take a look at tonight's headlines, but we urge our listeners to stay tuned. We will be right back.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
IMF report tabled in Parliament. President says difficulties and reforms can be discussed at the 6-month review with the IMF.
අප මේ මාර්ගයෙන් ඉවත් වුණොත් පසුගිය අප්‍රේල් මාසයේ තිබුණ තැනටත් වඩා අන්ත අයහපත් තත්වයකට මුළු රටම ඇද වැටෙනවා.
Harsher questions missing documents and letter of consent. Basil Rajapaksa recommended bringing in Ranil Wickremesinghe, says State Minister Indika Anuruddha.
මේ ඉතිරි ක්‍රියාමාර්ග ඉස්සරහට කරන් යන්න ඕන නම් කරන්න පුළුවන් එකම මිනිහා රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ මැතිතුමයි කියන නිර්දේශ දුන්නේ බැසිල් රාජපක්ෂ මැතිතුමා තමයි.
Sri Lankan rupee appreciates against US dollar. Gold prices also dropped. Protest to counter the protest by teachers.
$23% for 2 months, 25% for 4 months. Valuable FD. 23% for 2 months, 25% for 4 months. Valuable FD.
Newsfirst,
Good
Newsline.
evening and welcome back to Newsline. You're with me, Shehan Ranatunga, sitting in for Farah Shaukatali. Our guest this evening is Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, the former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Welcome back, Doctor. Doctor, we have been discussing the IMF program. Now, my next question to you is referring to your role as a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. You were in the central bank when popular, unpopular decisions were being made. And here we are today, Sri Lanka, depending on another IMF bailout. Now, where did we go wrong, Doctor? You yourself have spent so many years at the central bank. Where did we go wrong?
Well, in fact, Sri Lanka had, prior to this, gone to IMF on 16 occasions. And Sri Lanka had completed the IMF program only on 9 occasions. 7 occasions we had defaulted midway through because we were not able to meet the IMF conditionality, so that the Sri Lanka had to default it on its own. So what would happen is, Shehan, the IMF program is based on a particular philosophy and ideology which it holds, which actually tries to get all the 6 sectors together. I mean, we have 6 sectors. I mean, we have the sickness is, very high. We have the ailing economy because with negative economic growth. Then we have the external sector with enormous pressure for Sri Lanka rupees to depreciate further. Then we have the fiscal sector where the government is unable to meet its, even the day-to-day expenditure programs. Then we have the monetary sector where the inflation is rising very high. So the IMF program requires us to tighten all the loopholes in those, sectors, and release the resources that we save for the growth of the country. What it means is, it's like a, belt tightening program which the ordinary people refer to in their own day-to-day discussions. Now, in the present one also, in the past also, as you have said, what happened was Sri Lanka was not able to go through that belt tightening program, and as a result, Sri Lanka had to abandon it midway. In the present case also, Shehan, what has been proposed by the IMF in the program is not a very rosy one. It requires the government of Sri Lanka to tighten its belt to the maximum level. Now, for example, in the program, there is no any prospect for the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to lend money to IMF, to lend money to government and finance the budget, because which people normally refer to as the money printing. That has been completely curtailed. And also in the new Central Banking Act, which is now has been gazetted and which will be presented to Parliament shortly, they have prohibited the central bank from buying treasury bills from the primary market and lending the government. And also various other facilities which central bank is providing to government, like the extension of these provisional advances, had also been curtailed. So the money from the central bank will not be forthcoming. And also every year when the central bank made a thumping profit, a significant amount that profit was transferred to government by way of a profit transfer of the central bank. In the present program, Shehan, that has been brought to a zero level. The central bank cannot transfer its profits to government to finance its budget, but central bank will have to use those profits to build up its own internal capital resources. So therefore, over the next 4.5 year time period, the budget cannot expect any money from the central bank by way of a profit transfer. So again, the program requires the government to cut down its total gross expenditure, so that the gross financial requirement, that is the total expenditure of the government minus the revenue that it might raise, that deficit has to be curtailed. It is presently about, say, 27% of our GDP. And over the program period, that has to be brought down to about 8% of our GDP. What it means is government will have to simultaneously increase the revenue base. At the same time, it has to cut down its expenditure program. So what it means is that it's a very tight, belt-tightening program for Sri Lanka. And the parliamentarians who are to approve this particular program will have to be mindful of the fact that they are actually going through a serious austerity program through this. And as a result, whatever the fallout of the program, the social dissension, the people might come to street, will have to be faced by the government, and people have to manage it very properly. The Ranil Wickremesinghe administration will have to manage it properly without using, this aggressive power. It has to manage it properly. So this is what is forthcoming, and also it is actually a very, very important thing that we have to keep in our mind. The program does not permit the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to practice what had been practiced by Governor Cabral and also Governor W.D. Lakshman in the form of what is known as this modern monetary theory. Because the modern monetary theory actually allows them to print money and finance the government budget, so that they think that it will not cause inflation or depreciation of the currency. It will lead to economic growth. That has been completely stopped. Instead, the program requires the government to raise revenue and also use that revenue prudently, and also divert those revenue and the resources for productive investment and bring about growth in the economy through that, rather than getting the central bank to print money and causing inflation and exchange rate depreciation. So these are very important things. The other one is that I had noted that, even the president had expressed his, wish that Sri Lanka rupee will appreciate to a level of about, say, 185 to 200 over the time. That is something that we should not permit to do, because our inflation rate is already at 50%. Prices have actually doubled. If you look at the price level in 2021 and now at the beginning of the 2023, it has almost doubled. So because of this reason, the exchange rate cannot be reduced to that level unless there is a corresponding improvement in productivity. Because if you have a productivity, then the exchange rate reduction will actually will be accommodated by the improvement in productivity. But we don't have any plan to improve the productivity. So what would happen is the Sri Lanka government, the central bank and the government will have to allow the exchange rate to further depreciate from the current level. But it will happen because the International Monetary Fund wants, under its program, the central bank to build up its foreign reserves by buying foreign currency from the market. When it buys from the foreign currency from the market, there cannot be any appreciation of the foreign exchange rate, because whatever the excess money available will be bought by the central bank, and that building up will have to be continued, because in this year itself, central bank will have to buy about $1,500 million, and by the time we complete the program in the first half of 2028, the reserve level will have to go up to 10 billion US dollars. For that purpose, central bank will have to allow gradually to depreciate the currency, and that is a must. So these things that some politicians are expressing, that exchange rate will be appreciated and there will be relief for the people of the country, that may be simply a wish without knowing what we have inside this program with IMF.
Doctor, you painted a rather bleak picture. So you're saying that we will have to go through perhaps some of the most severe austerity measures imposed in the history of Sri Lanka. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, there's no question, Shehan, because since we are a bankrupt country, even with IMF or without IMF, we have to go through that austerity measures. We have to change our lifestyle. So what must be done is, as in the case of this Japan after the Second World War, when the economy had been completely destroyed by the war, the Japanese people had to go through a severe austerity program like us. But they did that. And what they did was sometimes they worked for 6 months without getting any pay. And they copied the technology from the Western countries, imitated that technology in that country. Then they developed their own technology to supplement what had been copied. And they were able to create a massive industrial powerhouse in Japan, so that Japan was able to come out of the severe economic crisis by 1960s. So same option is the one which we also have to follow. So therefore, this particular factor has to be taken into mind by all the people who are now to get this IMF support from for the rescue of the country. It is not the free money that has been given, very small quantity. We have to stand our own feet and come out of this one by working hard, improving our productivity and enhancing our production base and so forth.
Well, Doctor, I mean, taking what you just said and also looking at what's happening globally. Now, we know that just recently, 6 central banks, namely the European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Bank of Canada, and the Swiss National Bank, they decide to rally together to beat a possible global financial crisis. So in that kind of a context, what kind of a picture are we looking at here for Sri Lanka?
Well, the program has already put it as one of the benchmarks, Shehan. Sri Lanka Central Bank will have to hire an external expert to assess the asset quality of the leading financial institutions in the country. So that includes the Bank of Ceylon, People's Bank, National Savings Bank, and also the leading private sector banks. And that report has to be ready by June this year. And if the report says that the quality of the assets of the financial institutions has been eroded and leading to the reduction in the capital base, we'll have to recapitalize them. So that is how we'll have to address the issue now. I mean, that means now in the case of the state banks, either the government will have to give the capital or the state banks will have to go to the market and get the capital from the members of the public. So those are the options that are available to us depending on the type of report being now prepared by these external experts for the central bank, which has commissioned that report on the direction of the International Monetary Fund. So this is happening in Sri Lanka also, because what matters to us in Sri Lanka is now this Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, which collapsed in California. The main reason for the collapse of the bank was that the Federal Reserve System had increased the interest rates, not from say 12% to 30% as in now, okay, from about say 2% to 4%. But because of the increase in the interest rates, the book value of the bonds and the debentures that bank had been holding had come down, reducing its capital to near zero level. And as a result, it had gone into a liquidity crisis. So there was a run on the bank. Depositors want to get their money, and the bank had to be closed down. In the case of Sri Lanka, even though our interest rates have gone up from 12 to 30%, we didn't encounter such a fiasco, basically because our investments in bonds and treasury bills and treasury bond is a very small portion of the total asset portfolio of a bank. For example, it's about say 20% of the total asset portfolio. So there was a loss on that count, But at the same time, since the loan book of the banks had been very low, very high, our banks were able to, manage, absorb those losses. But what would happen is that depending on the report which is now being prepared, if the asset quality has gone down and we have to recapitalize in order to save those banks, it's not an option available. We have to do it.
Dr. W. Wijewardena, we thank you as always for your time on Newsline. And we certainly look forward to seeing you again on the program. To our viewers, we would like to encourage you also, if you want to know more about the IMF program and the road ahead, do watch Face the Nation tonight as the topic is discussed in greater detail. Doctor, we wish we could have you on Face the Nation tonight, but I know it's difficult for you to be present there. But certainly we look forward to seeing you on Newsline soon again.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
And with that, we now hand it over to Primetime News on TV1.